I'm so grateful that you're here. Thank you for attending. A friend of mine from Boy Scouts, Tom Linderman, who's probably watching this presentation online, made hardtack for a camping trip a few years ago. And I thought, maybe I should make some and bring it tonight. So in the back of the room, I have a Civil War meal for you to taste, hardtack and black coffee or water. Be careful though, hardtack gets its name from being hard. Hardtack was typically made in 3-inch squares, a 1/4 inch thick, and I figured nobody needs that much, so I made them a 1/4 the size, and the first batch being a 1/4 inch thick, and the second batch an 1/8 inch thick, as the first was hard to eat, being so hard. This is what, like I said, the soldiers lived on during their travels. If they were lucky, they sometimes got salt pork with it. Most of my information I'm presenting about the 7th travels came from the writings of Sergeant Raymer from Company B. I wanted also to mention that the Minnesota Historical Society, who I also got information from for this presentation, is again holding the State Capitol Civil War tours on November 15th. The Capitol was planned when most of the legislators were Civil War veterans, so it has art from the Civil War era. I went a few years ago with my friend Jim, and it was very well done, and I would recommend you do that if you're available. Emily usually asks me, why this topic? Well, I've been researching my family's genealogy since my grandmother Mavis got me interested while I was in high school. I'm also from what I would call an Army family. Both my brothers and I were in the regular Army. My youngest brother David was in the Desert Storm War. My father David was in the Korean War. My grandfather Lawrence in World War I. My great-grandfather Lewis Seymour in Company K in Stillwater. And my great-great-grandfather James Madison Canfield in the Civil War, as well as many 5th and 6th great-grandfathers in the Revolutionary and French and Indian Wars. So let's look at a brief history of my great-great-grandfather James Madison Canfield. His ancestor, Thomas Canfield, immigrated from England in 1638 and has a place on the Founders Bridge in Milford, Connecticut. In 1815, after 177 years in Milford, Herman Canfield moves to the Finger Lakes area of New York State. He marries a local girl, Anna Eunice Smith, and they have 5 sons and 4 daughters. Great-great-grandfather James is the youngest, and his father dies at the age of 46 when he is 3.5 years old. After the death of their father, most of the Canfield siblings moved to Winona County in Minnesota in the 1850s, including Nelson and his wife Sarah Durham, Ira and his wife Julia Ordway, Mary and her husband Louis Mann, Anne and her spouse Peter Becker, Ellen and her husband Solomon Baldwin. Mother Hannah also moves and resides with daughter Ellen's family. James and his spouse Rebecca Brill. James's future father and mother-in-law Christopher Brill and Marianne Knight moved to Fillmore County in the 1850s from Ohio. James marries Rebecca Brill in 1861 in Fillmore County. By the way, my middle name is Brill. I'm named after Rebecca. They have a daughter, Myrna, before the war, and while in the war, James's wife, Rebecca, and daughter stay with her brother, Hezekiah Brill. After the war, they had 3 more children. Rosella is my grandmother Mavis's mother. The family moves to Stillwater in about 1883. When doing genealogy and searching for James, the 1890 Stillwater Directory lists his wife, Rebecca, as widowed. It appears that she was done with him, as in fact, he was not deceased. I often wondered if the Civil War had maybe messed with his mind and maybe he had PTSD and just had trouble coping. He shows up moving to Minneapolis in 1888 and working as a laborer and eventually living at the Minneapolis Veterans Home. He alternates back and forth between the Veterans Home in Minneapolis and Milwaukee, eventually passing away in 1908, and he's buried at the Wood National Cemetery in Milwaukee. James enlists in Saratoga, Winona County on the 15th of August, 1862 at the age of 24 as a sergeant, along with his two nephews from his oldest brother Nelson, Herman, age 18, and Alvin, age 16. I would imagine that Alvin probably faked his age when he enlisted. They all ended up in Company D of the Minnesota 7th. A private earned $13 a month, or $406 inflated today, and James, as a sergeant, earned an additional $3 a month, or $531 in today's dollars. They also received an annual clothing allotment of $120. James's brother-in-law, Hezekiah Brill, enlisted in 1865 and served in Company C of the 1st Minnesota. As an Army veteran, I was not familiar with what a regiment was. Most of the units in the Civil War Army and today's Army are the same, except for a regiment, which is now referred to as a battalion. A regiment is made up of 10 companies of about 100 soldiers, making a regiment about 1,000 men. Today's equivalent battalions are typically much smaller, although my combat engineer battalion was about 900 soldiers. For most of the war, the 7th was assigned to the 16th Corps, which had between 30,000 and 40,000 soldiers in it. One of the fun things I did at work for my staff was post a daily Civil War slang, which I'm including at the bottom of the slides. I was going to let you read them, but thought it might be difficult for the people online to see them, so I will read them. Blue Mass, men on sick call, named after the blue pill. I believe the blue pill has a different meaning today. So where were the men of the 7th Minnesota from? Company A was primarily from Rice County, Blue Earth being the county seat. The company formed in August 1862 and were called on August 18th to respond to the outbreak of the Dakota War. Acknowledge the corn, to admit the truth, to confess a lie, or acknowledge an obvious personal shortcoming. Company B was from the Utica area on the western side of Winona County. This is from Sergeant Raymer's account. I was raking grain off a 4-horse McCormick reaper in my father's wheat field. I stepped off, telling my brother Charles to take the rake, for I was going to enlist. Others joined, making 8 that left the harvest to volunteer. I'm sure his dad was really happy that day. We started for Winona at 11 o'clock and got there at 3. The next day at 11 o'clock, we started by boat for Fort Snelling. We got to St. Paul at 6 the next morning and marched to the state capitol, where we elected officers. We took the boat again and reached the fort at 11 a.m. At Fort Snelling, we had our first meal of Army rations: hardtack, salt pork, black coffee on tin plates. Most of the company had lived well, a few luxuriously. It made some of the more delicate ones look homesick. In the afternoon, we received our uniform and guns and equipment. It was hard for some of the men to get a good fit of clothing. The small men could not find clothes small enough, nor the large men large enough. I had to take a coat, much too small, which gave amusement to the boys. Artillery, camp kettles, stoves, pots, tubs, iron, foundries. Company C was from Chisago and Washington counties. 19 from Taylor's Falls, Marine 16, 3 from Stillwater, Lakeland 7, and Afton 13. On Saturday, August 9th, there was a war meeting held about a mile above Afton Village. Quite a large gathering was there. Speeches were made from a wagon. At the conclusion, men were called to come forward and enlist. The company at once went to Fort Snelling via the packet steamer H.S. Allen to be mustered in. This is one of my favorite quotes from Sergeant Raymer's diary. Another meeting was held at Lakeland when Howard Oliver, known afterward as our tall sergeant, put his name down. His father, a very old man, made us a brief speech in which he said, "This is my 6th son to go into the Army, and if I was a little younger, I would go too." That old man, tottering on the brink of the grave, giving up his 6th and last boy, wishing only that he was young enough to go, made the most eloquent speech I ever heard. Bait. A quantity of food. Example, we ate ourselves a bait of collards. Across Winona County came the men of Company D. Wagon loads of men fell into line, headed for Winona, and met at Paris's Tavern and took dinner. Sisters held to their brothers, dreading to have them leave their sides. Mothers and wives, without fortitude to see the sacrifice, yet willing to make it, bowed their heads and covered their eyes as sons and husbands walked forward to give their names. The company at once went to Fort Snelling to be mustered in. Baited for widow, attractively or well-dressed, used to refer to men, especially beyond the marrying age. The majority of Company E was from the city of Preston in Fillmore County. Men left their reapers in the fields, their grain uncut, their stacks half-built, and came pouring into Preston with bands of music and banners flying to listen to the patriotic speeches. Bark juice, liquor. From Hastings and the area around Dakota County, with a few from Washington County, came the men of Company F. Barrel shirt, barrel worn by thieves for punishment. The men of Company G were split between Red Wing and Goodhue County and Winona from Winona County. Enlistment proceeded rapidly. In 5 days, a complement was secured and started for boat to Fort Snelling. They were then furloughed and went home to finish harvest. The 26th of August found the men hurriedly recalled to Fort Snelling by the Indian massacre. Beehive, knapsack. The farmer youths of Sibley County made up 61 men and the remainder from Ramsey County for Company H. The Indian War broke out the day before they were united into a company at Fort Snelling. They were put into service without clothing or arms. Big bugs, big wigs, important people. Company I came from the northern part of the state, from the counties of Stearns, Benton, Sherburne, and Todd. In less than a week, 88 young and vigorous men enrolled, only 4 being over 35 years of age. 68 were native-born citizens. Just as the company was ready to start to Fort Snelling to be mustered in, expecting to go south, news of the terrible Sioux massacre was received. Many had families exposed on the frontier, yet they hurried to Fort Snelling. They were hastily examined and armed with Springfield muskets and supplied with only 2 rounds of ammunition each. Clothing and blankets could not be had. Billy Yank, federal soldier, a private or especially one whose name is not known. From the towns of Cleveland, Cordova, Waterville, Eliason, and Kasota of Le Sueur County came the men of Company K. A war meeting was held in Cleveland, and around 65 men publicly agreed to enter an organization to be called the Cleveland Guards. After a good dinner at the Baptist Church, the night was passed at Farnham's Hotel below Belle Plaine. At Shakopee, they took the boat, arriving at Fort Snelling the next day. Bite the bullet, to stand firm under attack. The 7th had 3 different commanders during the time it was organized. Henry Hastings Sibley, the first governor of Minnesota, was appointed colonel of the 7th by Governor Alexander Ramsey, serving 4 months from August 1862. The city of Hastings was named after him. Next was Colonel Stephen Miller, who first served in the 1st Minnesota Regiment in the Civil War East, returning to Minnesota to replace Colonel Sibley in November 1862. He later served as governor of Minnesota from 1864 to 1866. William Rainey Marshall replaced Colonel Miller in November 1863, being in command of most of the Civil War. He originally enlisted as a private in the 8th Minnesota and was quickly appointed lieutenant colonel of the 7th in August 1862. He also went on to become governor of Minnesota from 1866 to 1870. Marshall County is named after him. Bluebellies, Union soldiers. Just think about the quantity of supplies that were needed to supply a regiment of 1,000 soldiers. To transport those supplies, each regiment was assigned 13 6-mule wagons. One for headquarters tents, office and baggage, one for quartermaster stores, and one for a hospital outfit. And one wagon for tents and baggage of each of the 10 companies. In the spring of 1863, pup tents were issued and the 10 company wagons disappeared as the soldiers carried their own tents, axes, and shovels. Axes and shovels were used to construct rifle pits and repair roads. Invariably, the tools were lost. A lieutenant, sergeant, corporal, and 2 privates were assigned to be pioneers, what we know as engineers in today's Army, and carry and use this equipment. The pioneers were issued revolvers instead of rifles. Bragg's bodyguard, body lace. The 7th traveled those 10,600 or so miles by train, marching, and by steamboat. As we go through the presentation, I'll review how they traveled, the color green for marching, black for train travel, and blue for travel by boat. Bread bag, haversack. They first went into the Dakota conflict, so let's just review that really quickly. White settlers moving in, displacing the Dakota. Treaties were signed to move the Dakota, but not followed through, including the government providing supplies, food, and money to them. They were expected to take on Euro-American agricultural practices, and those who did not were refused food and money. I think I read 25% of the Native Americans tried to be farmers. The harvest of 1861 was poor, followed by a harsh winter. Government agents and traders were often corrupt. Thomas Galbraith, the lower agency agent, withheld food, supplies, and money to the tribes. Andrew Myrick, a government trader, was asked to sell them food on credit. His response was, "So as far as I'm concerned, if they are hungry, let them eat grass or their own dung." August 17, 1862, four Dakota men murdered 5 white colonist settlers near Acton Township in Meeker County, which is halfway between Litchfield and Wilmer. The next day, Chief Little Crow led a group of Dakota warriors to attack the lower agency just east of Redwood Falls on the Minnesota River. They burned the buildings, but allowed the white settlers time to escape across the river at Redwood Ferry. Myrick's body was found with grass stuffed in his mouth. There were an estimated 6,500 Dakota in the area, and only about 1,000 were involved in the war. Most of them wanted to remain peaceful. Breadbasket, stomach. At Fort Snelling, the morning of the 27th, we got our breakfast and received 16 rounds of ammunition. Company D proceeded to Fort Abercrombie in the Dakota Territory on September 10th. It was a march of approximately 225 miles, which took 13 days, averaging 17 miles a day. Company C and I proceeded to Fort Ripley, approximately 125 miles away. Company H and K marched to St. Peter, and Company H on to the relief of New Ulm. Company E went to Medalia and eventually to an outpost to the southwest. The remainder of the regiment, Companies A, B, F, and G, started by boat and arrived at Shakopee the next morning. From Shakopee, they departed on foot at 3 p.m. for Fort Ridgely. A brevet eagle, a brevet's an officer, so he was a turkey. Fort Abercrombie was established in 1858 in a place known as Graham's Point, just across the Minnesota border. It was a fairly small garrison for the newly added 100 soldiers of Company D, and that is where my great-grandfather was stationed for a while. Brevet, horse, which is also an officer, a mule. Fort Ripley was on the western bank of the Mississippi River. 3 sides had walls and the riverside open. It is now within Camp Ripley north of Little Falls. Bumblebee, sound for flying mini balls. After the 10-mile march from Shakopee, we camped for the night. This being our first experience at pitching tents, we made awkward work. On September 2nd, we arrived at Fort Ridgely. Bummer's cap, army cap with high crown. It could be filled with gathered foodstuffs. Fort Ridgely was established in 1853. Unlike Fort Abercrombie or Ripley, it was built without a defensive wall or guard towers, making it extremely vulnerable to attack. There were about 280 military and civilian personnel at the fort. It was attacked on August 20th and 22nd, 1862, before reinforcements from Fort Snelling arrived, although the Army was able to repel both attacks. The fort was abandoned in 1867, and civilians dismantled most of the buildings to use the materials. In the 1930s, the foundations were excavated and the powder magazine and commissary buildings were replicated by the Civilian Conservation Corps. Buttermilk Cavalry, term infantry head for cavalry. September 2nd through September 23rd, Fort Ridgely to Birch Coulee Battlefield, back to Fort Ridgely, and then to the Battle of Wood Lake. Busthead, cheap whiskey. The 7th arrived at Fort Ridgely at 4 p.m. on September 2nd. In a little over 2 hours, we were in line again, 2 pieces of hardtack issued to each man. It was a light supper after marching 22 miles and then having to march 16 miles to Birch Coulee, arriving a couple miles away at midnight. They arrived at the battlefield of Birch Coulee at 10 the next morning. The battle was won by the Dakota. Was finished. It was a sorrowful scene. Some of the survivors tried to cheer. Others shed silent tears. Some begged for water. Others for something to eat. They had been besieged and had fought 36 hours without water and having but little to eat. The tents and wagons were riddled with bullets. In looking over the camp, we found 13 dead soldiers and 39 wounded, many of whom died. 90 horses lay dead at the picket rope, only one still standing but wounded. We fried salt pork and made cake with flour and water and fried it in the pork fat. With coffee, constituted our first meal since the morning the day before. We buried the dead, loaded the wounded on wagons, and returned to the fort at midnight. We lay down to sleep without anything to eat, tired out, having marched in 2 days, 54 miles, almost without rest. Camp itch, an itch caused by remaining in camp too long without proper washing. The Battle of Wood Lake, September 18th through the 24th. Colonel Henry Hastings Sibley against Dakota Chief Little Crow. Chicken bosom, chicken breast. You never say breast in mixed company. On September 18th, we crossed the river from Fort Ridgely and camped below a small lake. On the 21st, we marched about 16 miles, passing the ruins of the Redwood Agency. The next day, we marched about 15 miles and camped just south of a small stream flowing from Wood Lake. On September 23rd, reveille was sounded at 4 a.m., and we eventually went into battle. We were deployed toward this stream where the Dakota had opened fire on the 3rd Regiment. We advanced steadily, keeping close to the ground, and made a charge on the double quick that cleared the ravine and ended the battle. Of the 4 soldiers killed, 1 was from the 7th. This was supposed to be the final battle of the war, as most of the Dakota surrendered. Chicken guts, officer's gold braiding on his cuff. Battle of Wood Lake, Minnesota to the Missouri River, Dakota Territory, September 24th through October 19th, 1862. Company Q, fictitious unit designated for sick list. On September 25th, we were on the march early to the Yellow Medicine River. We passed the Upper or Yellow Medicine Agency. All the buildings had been burned. The next day on our march, we passed a deserted village and came in sight of the great friendly Indian camp of 2,000 or more. It was about a half-mile south of the Minnesota River, on a high prairie, opposite the mouth of the Chippewa River named Camp Release. While at Camp Release, a captain from General Pope's staff arrived and duly mustered us into service, as we had left Fort Snelling too hurriedly for that ceremony. We also saw the paymaster for the first time and recovered 1 month's pay and $25 bounty. The 13th of October, a force including Company B of the 7th headed west towards the Missouri River. Copperhead, northerner with Southern anti-Union sympathies. Started at midnight, making a forced march of about 35 miles and camped near the eastern edge of the Coteau near the Dakota border. On the 16th, we made a weary march into the night and bivouacked without food or water. The next morning, we got to the Big Sioux River. On the 17th, the cavalry arrived at the eastern slope of the James River Valley, and we met them on the return east. Our 4-day rations had been exhausted. We luckily got some flour from the Indians. Croaker sack, burlap sack, a gunny sack. Missouri River, Dakota Territory to Mankato, Minnesota, October 20th to December 5th, 1862. Creeper, a soldier's frying pan used early in the war. When we got back to Camp Release, it was a most dismal day, a blizzard blowing, ashes and cinders from the burnt prairie that darkened the air worse than a snowstorm. We had marched over 200 miles in 8 days and were tired enough. Dead as a wagon tire, expired. Camp Release was abandoned on October 24th, and we marched for the lower agency, where we arrived and established Camp Pope, named after U.S. Major General John Pope, who controlled U.S. forces in Minnesota. This is where the trials of the Indians took place. 303 Dakotas were sentenced to death by hanging. Desecrated vegetables. Union term for dehydrated vegetables formed into yellowish squares. I don't know if that's better than hardtack or not. On November 8th, the whole command with prisoners and wagons started for Mankato. At New Ulm, the citizens tried to kill the prisoners, but were successfully resisted by the guards. We got to Camp Lincoln at the mouth of the Blue Earth River November 10th. Dog robber, soldier detailed from the ranks to act as a cook. At the end of November, Company C and I returned to Mankato from Fort Ripley. Company K also joined the regiment here from St. Peter. On December 5th, Camp Lincoln was abandoned and we moved into quarters in abandoned buildings in Mankato until May 30th, 1863. Doughface, Northerners who favor slavery. While the rest of the regiment stayed at Mankato, Company B went to Tivoli, Winnebago Agency for the winter, and Company A went to Fairmont for the winter. Elephant, a battle. Seeing the elephant is witnessing a battle. President Lincoln ordered a review of the trial transcripts of the 303 Indians sentenced to death, and his administration found that there was enough evidence to warrant the death penalty in only 39 cases. One was given a reprieve shortly before his sentence was to be carried out. On December 26, 1862 in Mankato, 38 Indians were hanged. The largest mass execution in U.S. history was carried out. Embalmed beef, government issued canned beef. While in Mankato, a beautiful silk flag was presented by John A. Matthews of Winona to Company B, and by that company presented to the regiment and borne by it through the war. Each major battle was added throughout the war. The flag is now in the ownership of the Minnesota Historical Society and is rotated as a display at the state capitol. Essence of coffee, form of instant coffee found in paste form. Mankato, Minnesota to the Missouri River, Dakota Territory, May 30th through July 30th, 1863. Fighting under the black flag, killing lice. On May 30th, 1863, they departed Mankato for Camp Pope at the mouth of the Redwood River. Sibley's army had a strength of just over 4,000 soldiers when it left Camp Pope, moving to the south side of the Minnesota River on June 16th. We reached the head of the Big Stone Lake June 26th and remained in this camp until June 30th. We called it Camp McLaren. It was so dry when we reached Big Stone Lake that the hardtack was falling to pieces and had to be coopered and reloaded, whatever that means. Flicker, coward, as a verb to retreat. June 1st, we left Camp McLaren and headed towards Devil's Lake, reached the Great Bend in the Cheyenne River on July 4th. We passed through a grasshopper district south of the Cheyenne, where only stiff straw of the marsh grass was left, all the blades of the grass eaten away. The hoppers threatened to defeat us by leaving no forage for our mules and horses. July 9th, the men of Company D arrived from Fort Abercrombie to join the regiment. July 11th, we broke camp and marched north along the Cheyenne River. Effers, fellows, companions. I think that may have a different meaning today as well. Battle of Big Mound, Colonel Henry Hastings Sibley versus Santee Dakota Chief Red End. Goober pea, peanut. July 18th, 1863, we went to a camp near a lake, a mile and a half southwest of Lake Jesse. The next day, we arrived at Camp Atkinson. Company C and I stayed there and went in search of Indians on the west side of Devil's Lake. On the 20th, we resumed the march in a southwesterly course for 20 miles and camped. The next morning, we passed a hunter's camp and crossed the James River and camped on the west side. July 23rd, we traveled along the border of the Coteau, Missouri. At 5 a.m., the next morning, we were on the march again. We reached the high hill, which we called Big Mound. At Big Mound, the 7th was ordered out, and with the cavalry, charged the Indians, driving them from the hills southward into the plains. A thunderstorm came on, 2 heavy bolts striking the earth, killing 1 cavalryman. We pursued the Indians and were hungry, thirsty, and tired, but pressed on. The Indians started to throw away their belongings, and some of the men ate the tossed dried buffalo meat. We pushed on until 10 p.m. We laid down tired, hungry, and footsore. Galley nippers, Confederate term for insects or mosquitoes. On July 25th, we broke camp and moved 3 miles to a lake on the south side of the hills where we could get better water. We broke camp the next morning at 5 a.m. and at noon went into a camp near Dead Buffalo Lake. July 28th, we struck tents at 6 a.m. The teams formed into lines near together, some 5 or 6 lines wide, one regiment marching in front and one on each side forming a square. We marched this way for most of the day. The next day we broke camp at 4 a.m., crossed the Apple River, and shortly after noon halted about 2 miles from the Missouri River. We remained there until July 30th at noon, where the weather was very warm, 110 degrees in the shade. The men suffered for want of good water. Flux, diarrhea. Missouri River, Dakota Territory to Fort Snelling, Minnesota, August 1st through September 10th, 1863. 40 dead men, a full cartridge box, which usually held 40 rounds. August 1, we started our return march toward Camp Atkinson, passed the Battle of Big Mound on the 4th and went in by a lake. Camped on the 5th to rest the teams. August 7th on the march again at 6 a.m. and crossed the Coteau. August 10th, we arrived at Camp Atkinson. August 12th, we resumed our march to Fort Abercrombie and crossed the Cheyenne River on the 13th. The next day, we went into a camp at a lake on the south side of Mount Botino. Fresh fish, new recruits. On the 20th, an inspecting officer of the regular army inspected us at the second crossing of the Cheyenne. We crossed the Wild Rice River the next day, and at noon we arrived at Fort Abercrombie and remained there for 5 days. September 3rd, we stopped at Sauk Center. The men were happy to eat real food again. They feasted on biscuits, cheese, and milk. Their food on the march had been hardtack and water. We arrived at Fort Snelling on the 9th or 10th, just completing a long, weary march of about 1,200 miles in 89 days, averaging 13 miles a day. The men stood this march remarkably well. A great many made the whole trip without once getting or trying to get a ride. In summary of the Dakota War, more than 600 citizens and soldiers were killed, which included 120 soldiers and an estimated 75 to 100 Dakota soldiers. More than 25% of the Dakota people who surrendered in 1862 died during the following year. Giving the vermin a parole, throwing away clothes infected with lice. Lice must have been a common thing for them. I had a relative visit from Sweden this summer, and I was telling her about my presentation, and she said, well, we have a distant relative that lives here and was part of, his ancestor was part of C Company of the Minnesota 7th. And he put together this map, and each night they stopped to camp, they gave it a name. I'm not sure how they selected the names of the camps, most likely after a soldier. Go boil your shirt. Take a hike, get lost, bug off. After receiving a leave of absence of 20 days to go home, we were back again at Fort Snelling and took a steamer to head south down the Mississippi River October 7th, 1863. After a 14-month delay, they were finally headed for the war they had signed up to fight in. Grapevine, telegraph wire. It was a 4-day journey down the Mississippi to St. Louis. Gravel, scurvy. They arrived in St. Louis, Missouri, October 11th, 1863, staying until April 20th, 1864. Graybacks, Southern soldiers, or lice. The 7th stayed at Schofield Barracks about 2 miles from the levee in a residential area and worked as guards at McDowell's College, which was confiscated and converted to Gratiot military prison in 1861 by the federal government. The prison was unique in that it was used not only to hold Confederate prisoners of war, but spies, guerrillas, civilians suspected of disloyalty, and even Union soldiers accused of crimes and misbehavior. The prison also was centered in a city of divided loyalties. Escapees could find refuge in homes not even a half a block away from the prison. When General Grant was in St. Louis on his way to Washington to take charge of the Army of the Potomac, the regiment was marched in review past his headquarters. After our march, Colonel Marshall walked on foot a short distance at the head of the regiment, his orderly having taken his horse to a grass plot to graze. And when he came in front of a large residence, a little girl about 6 years old, dressed in white, low-necked, short-sleeved dress, with a bow of red ribbon on her shoulder and a bow of blue on the other shoulder, her curls dangling down her back, carrying a small flag in each hand, came running down the walk crying, "Hooray for the Union!" The colonel stopped and kissed her, which made the boys in the ranks cheer lustily. Hardtack, unleavened bread in the form of a quarter-inch thick cracker issued by the Army. Mayfield, Kentucky Campaign, St. Louis to Memphis, Tennessee, April 20th to June 22nd, 1864. Haversack, canvas bag about 1 foot square slung over a shoulder and used to carry rations on a march. On April 20th, 1864, we were back on the steamer Rob Roy, heading down the Mississippi and up the Ohio, this time for Paducah, Kentucky. Hoofing it, marching. The regiment went out to Mayfield about 25 miles to reconnoiter, but saw no force in that direction. It remained here until June 19th, 1864. Went into camp west of the city near a fort occupied by colored troops. It was reported that there was a force of rebels nearby. About midnight, we were called into line and received 10 extra rounds of cartridges. After an hour, we were allowed to return to our tents. Hop, skip, jump, a two-wheeled ambulance. On June 19, 1864, we started for Memphis, arriving 3 days later and assigned to the right wing of the 16th Corps under General A.J. Smith in the 3rd Brigade, 1st Division. Sergeant Raymer didn't specify how they traveled. It would have been a 150-mile-long trip. Based on previous marching, they seemed to cover 10 to 20 miles a day, which would have taken at least a week to march, so I believe most of the trip was by train. They often traveled with between 10,000 and 40,000 soldiers. Can you just imagine how long a line it would be for that many soldiers and how long it would take them to get all out and moving on the road? Or even how many trains and the length of time to load and unload 30,000 soldiers. Horse collar, blanket roll. Battle of Tupelo, Mississippi. Memphis, Tennessee and back, April 22nd to July 20th, 1864. Hospital rat, someone who fakes an illness to get out of duty. Around June 24th, 1864, the regiment went to the Memphis and Charleston depot and took the cars. We went about 30 miles in camp, this being as far as the cars could be run at that time. The next morning, we marched to Moscow, Tennessee, and remained there until the 26th or 27th of June. We then went to LaGrange, where we remained a few days. Housewife, a sewing kit. On July 5th, 1864, the command, consisting of about 11,000 men under General A.J. Smith, entered the northern part of Mississippi. Arriving at Pontotoc, Mississippi in the afternoon of the 11th, on July 13th, we headed for Tupelo. Joy juice, liquor. Battle of Tupelo, U.S. Major General A.J. Smith versus Confederate States Lieutenant General Stephen Dilley. Kid, a child pickpocket. Remember, Tupelo is one of the names on the 7th flag. On the 13th of July, we started toward Tupelo, the 7th being the train guard. Had to march most of the time off the road, through the woods and fields. About 3 p.m., the rebels attacked us. The 7th advanced and drove them back. General Smith was alarmed. The heat was taking its toll on his soldiers. The men had little but coffee and worm-infested hardtack, and the ammunition supply was low. The next day, the 7th lay along a road and had pulled down a rail fence to shield them some. General Maurer sat on his horse, just out of range in the edge of the woods, watching his men and said, "What are you dodging for? They won't hurt you." Just then a shell passed through Company B of the 7th and took the leg off George Blackwell. The hard fighting lasted about 2 hours and the losses on both sides were heavy. But we drove the rebels back. Some of the wagon teams were killed and we had to abandon some ambulances and wagons. The 7th lost 10 killed and 52 wounded in that battle. Sergeant Smith was one who was killed. Lead pills, bullets. On July 16th, we resumed our march on half rations, which in a day or two after were reduced to quarter rations. On the 19th at Salem, Mississippi, we met a supply train and got full rations. After getting full rations, men who thought sow belly and hardtack rough fare now thought them delicious. The next day, while crossing Davis's Mills, some of the men leaned their guns against a beech tree while they filled their canteens. The guns fell down and one was discharged, wounding the John E. Pickney of Company I, who died on the 28th. We arrived at LaGrange, Tennessee on the 21st and at Memphis on the 22nd of July. On this raid, we had to forage a good deal or go hungry, although when we started, we had strict orders against foraging or stealing. We took cattle, sheep, hogs, goats, chickens, hams, and sometimes even a swarm of bees, and then had not enough to eat. We had no tents except the shelter tents, and most of the men threw them away. The weather was very hot, and many of the men gave out and never were with the regiment again. Lincolnites, Lincoln supporters. Oxford Raid, Memphis, Tennessee, and back, July 31st to August 30th, 1864. Manure spreaders, cavalry. July 31st, we left Memphis by train by way of LaGrange and Grand Junction, Tennessee, through Holly Springs, Waterford, Mississippi. About the August 7th, the 35th Iowa Regiment and the Minnesota 7th were sent forward with pioneers, what we call combat engineers today, to build a bridge across the Tallahatchie River. They first had to cross the river under fire and secure the other side so the bridge could be built and secure passage of the Army. While camped on the bank of the Tallahatchie after dark, before we had effected a crossing, the rebels brought some 6-pounders to the opposite side and shelled us. The mule teams got out of the way of the shells, started back over a corduroy road, and going fast made a great noise. Very soon the rebel guns ceased firing and we heard them going away. We were thankful for a quiet night, but wondered why the battery was withdrawn. Next day we captured a Texas captain. Colonel Marshall asked him why they were stopped shelling us the night before. Why, he said, we heard you bringing down the river some heavy artillery and we got out of the way. It was our mule wagons that vanquished the rebel artillery. The expedition went as far as Oxford, Mississippi, where many buildings were burned, before returning to Memphis, Tennessee on August 30th. Molly grubbing, to rest, lay about, recline, relax, dawdle. In pursuit of General Price, Arkansas through Missouri, September 3rd through mid-November 1864. Mule, meat rations. U.S. Major General A.J. Smith versus Confederate States Major General Sterling Price. General Price convinced superiors to permit him to invade Missouri in the fall of 1864, hoping yet to seize a state for the Confederacy, or at least imperil President Lincoln's chances for re-election that year. Being a former governor of Missouri, he was very familiar with the state. Mustered out, Rye term meaning killed in action. On the morning of the 3rd of September, we marched to the levee, lying there until late afternoon. We went upon transports and sailed for the White River in Arkansas. Arrived at Devall's Bluff, Arkansas on September 9th. And the 12th, we marched to Brownsville and camped there for a week. On September 17th, the division started north in pursuit of Price. Opening the ball, starting the battle. The march to Camp Girardeau, Missouri was about 300 miles in 19 days. That's about 16 miles a day on 10 days of rations. The men's shoes gave out so that many were barefooted. They had left Memphis, Tennessee in hot weather with light clothing. Cold nights came on and the men, almost naked, suffered severely. Parlor soldiers, poor soldiers. From Camp Girardeau to Jefferson City, Missouri, the division went by boats. Parole, prisoners taken an oath not to fight anymore and were released. From Jefferson City, Missouri, we marched to the Lamine Bridge, where the division was united with the rest of the Corps under General Smith. We marched towards Lexington, past Sedalia, marching until midnight. Noon the next day, we resumed the march. We got near the fight of the Little Blue, but not in time to take part. We followed the cavalry down the Kansas border to Harrisonville, Missouri, about October 28th. Partisan Rangers, civilian military units. About October 30th, we left Harrisonville for the march back to Jefferson City and on to St. Louis. The day we got to Sedalia, there was a heavy snowstorm. Peas on a trencher, breakfast call. We had bad weather and muddy and frozen roads all the way to St. Louis. One of the problems of being on the march at this time was the troops missed out on the presidential election on November 8, 1864. In the same election, the 7th former commander, Colonel Miller, was elected governor of Minnesota. Pepper box, pistol. Battle of Nashville, St. Louis to Eastport, Mississippi, November 24th to February 5th, 1865. Picket, sentries posted around camp or bivouac to guard approaches. General Smith's Corps required 59 steamboats to transport the command. Can you imagine? 59 steamboats. We left St. Louis by boat November 24th and got to Nashville November 30th. When we got to Nashville, we heard distinctly the Battle of Franklin that evening. The next morning saw the long trains bringing in some 2,000 wounded from that hard-fought battle. Pig sticker, bayonet. The Battle of Nashville, U.S. Major General George Henry Thomas versus Confederate States Lieutenant General John Bell Hood. Before the Battle of Nashville, there was considerable excitement at times, especially when a rabbit would be startled from its lair and run through the camp. The men would cheer and run after it. At other times, the men would cheer General Smith, as they always did when there was any show for a fight. The cheering became so common that when we heard it, the boys would ask, "Is it General Smith or a rabbit?" Play old soldier, pretend sickness to avoid combat. On the 14th, we received orders to be ready for battle at daylight the next morning. It was a very foggy and did not start until 8 a.m. We marched out of our works and advanced a short distance to the enemy. We advanced slowly until we crossed Hardin Pike. We could hear the enemy across a narrow cornfield. We advanced slowly through the cornfield, but the rebels had fallen back. After going about 200 yards through the field, the line went up into a ravine, sheltered by a small hill between us and the enemy, where we stayed for 2 hours. Our infantry advanced until about 50 yards, and we could see the fort clearly. The column never wavered, and the flags never halted, but charged straight up and over the works. In less than a minute, our men were firing the rebels' guns on them. Paleface, new recruits, fresh fish. The evening of the 15th, we halted and bivouacked for the night. That evening, as I was passing through Company K, I heard Corporal Archibald Savage, who was wounded at Tupelo, say, "Boys, this is my last day with you." One of his comrades asked, "Why?" And he answered, "I will be killed tomorrow." His comrade said, "Oh, don't be foolish. You are no more likely to be killed than anyone else." Savage said, "I am not foolish. I know that I will be killed tomorrow." It proved true, for the next day he was shot through the breast. We starting on the morning of November 16th, forming into line, that is, all but one man who stopped to tie his shoes and did not catch up with us for 3 days. Probably deliberate. After marching across the field and passing through the woods, we came into full view of the enemy about a half mile from us. We advanced about 500 yards from the enemy and lay there until about 3 in the afternoon. About 4 o'clock, orders came to get shovels and picks to throw up a breastwork. We started moving toward the enemy. A battery directly in front of us throwing canister, shot, and shell so lively that the air was darkened. The rain was falling and mud flying. We did not keep a good line, but all moved right along up their works and over them, capturing a large number of prisoners. The 7th Regiment lost in 2 days fighting at Nashville, 7 killed, 48 wounded. Pop a cap, shoot a gun. After leaving Nashville, it stopped raining toward night, and our brigade was fortunate in finding 3 millet sacks, which we took for beds. They were the only things that were dry. The next morning, November 17th, we marched early and waded in the mud all day, often up to our knees. Passing through Brentwood Hills, crossed the Franklin Pike. In the afternoon, we moved on a few miles and went into camp. On the 18th, we crossed the Harpeth River and went into camp in Franklin. The next day, we went after the enemy. On the evening of November 23rd, we arrived at Duck River opposite Columbia, where it was very cold and hard to make fires, as we had but a few axes and only a few rails. We had to make good fires, though, as many of the men neither had overcoats nor blankets. The next day, we crossed the Duck River and marched for 68 miles, with the weather being nice. We had no supply of rations, as our train had not crossed the river. About 4 o'clock, some of the boys asked me to go to Colonel Marshall and ask what he thought about our camping here. He replied that we were waiting for the train. If it arrived in time, we would go on, but if he thought it would be well enough to prepare camp. I reported to the boys, and immediately about half the brigade started for a rail fence 20 rods distance, and in less than half an hour, the whole farm was stripped of its fences. On the day after Christmas, we resumed our march, reaching Pulaski on the 27th. Quick step, diarrhea. At Pulaski, we gave up the pursuit of Hood. We passed through Lawrenceburg on the 29th and camped about 4 miles from there. It was a nice evening and we had plenty of fence rails, but about 8 o'clock p.m. it began to rain and grow colder. About midnight, the rain turned to snow and began to freeze fast. By 3 a.m., we had 3 inches of snow. It stopped snowing, but the wind blew hard. By daylight, many of the men started fires or they would have frozen. 3 comrades and myself, who slept together, got wet and covered with snow. The wind blew down our shelter. I had my overcoat on and lay on the outside. When I got up, my blanket was frozen to my overcoat, and that to my blouse. And I was shivering as though I had the ague, or malaria. On the morning of the 31st, we ate the last of our rations. We expected to get more that evening, but the roads were very bad from the snow and mud. We marched all day through a deserted country. No chickens, no hams, no sheep, no pigs, nor anything else edible. I traveled half the time away from the column trying to find something to eat, but could not. We went into camp early and waited patiently for the train to come with rations, but we did not get any that night. On January 1st, 1865, with nothing to eat, we were called into line and marched to the road. As we got to the road, General Smith and staff came riding by, and the boys, instead of cheering him as usual, called out, "Hungry New Year!" 3 groans for General Smith, and where is the hardtack? The general paid no attention, but shortly a wagon was driven along, and we got 2 pieces of hardtack each. We started on, but got no more rations until night. We arrived at Clifton on the Tennessee River on the 3rd of January and went into camp. January 6th, we were put on gunboats and landed at Eastport, Mississippi the next day. The camp was about a mile back from the river on high land in a forest. Not having tents, we built huts to shelter us. All the tools we had were axes. The mouth of the Tennessee River had frozen over, and boats with our supplies could not get up the river for about 2 weeks, which reduced the army to almost starvation. Men stole ears of corn from the mules' feed troughs to satisfy hunger. The 7th Minnesota was sent out about 8 miles to a little mill, a corn cracker, to gather corn from the farms and husk and shell it and grind it for the command. Those in charge of the mill kept it running day and night. We had no sieves to sift the coarse meal. At first we boiled it into mush, just that it was rough eating and it brought on diarrhea. We got most of the bran out by putting it in small vessels and shaking it sideways. The hulls would work up to the top. In this way we got along well. Finally the boys made a raise of a few sieves, then we were happy. We remained here about 8 days, having sent all the meal we could to the command at Eastport. Rio, coffee. Eastport, Mississippi to Vicksburg, Mississippi, and on to New Orleans, Louisiana, February 5th to February 21st, 1865. Roast beef, noon meal. We departed Eastport on the magnificent steamer Magenta on February 5th, steaming down the Tennessee and Ohio rivers, although they're going north. The boat stopped at Cairo, Kentucky for one day and then proceeded down the Mississippi. Salt horse, salted meat. Arriving at Vicksburg, Mississippi on the February 11th, we went into a camp about 2 miles from the city and stayed 8 days. Sardine box, cap box. Back on the Magenta, we embarked for New Orleans on February 19th and arriving in the afternoon of February 21st. It was a cold day. The wind blew so hard that the boats could not land on the wharf. Some landed on the opposite side of the river and others kept moving around in the river until dark. During the night, we landed about 5 miles below the city, and the next morning the ground was covered in snow. We went into camp and the ground was low and marshy, and we got brush and gray moss to make beds high enough to keep us out of the water while we slept. But the moment we put our feet out of the bed, they went into water. General Smith asked General Canby to allow him to take the men near the city on a piece of ground that was an old brickyard. General Canby said, "Why, General Smith, your men would steal anything they could lay their hands on." "Yes," replied General Smith. "They took 16 cannons in one day at Nashville." 3 days later, we moved to the brickyard without orders. It was a good campground and the men behaved as well as any soldiers could. While here, we received some potatoes and pickled cabbage from the Sanitary Commission. The first white sugar that we received while in the Army, we got here. Up to this time, it was all brown sugar, often very brown. Sawbones, surgeon. Spanish Fort Campaign, early March to April 13th, 1865. Stump liquor, corn liquor. Early in March, we broke camp and marched to Lake Pontchartrain and took steamboats for Dauphin Island off Mobile Bay. This was the first time at sea, and nearly everyone was seasick. We arrived at the island the next day and went into camp for about 2 weeks. It was warm spring weather, and we had good times there. We had plenty of oysters, so plenty that Major Burt hauled them into camp by the wagon load. Some young alligators were also caught and brought into camp as well. While at Dauphin Island, we got a few recruits for the 7th Regiment. 2 of them were assigned to Company B. They were mere boys, too young to be of any service. It was a shame to enlist such boys, for they could not stand Army life. It was a good thing the war ended soon. Seckish, derogatory term for Confederates or Southerners. Secessionists. About March 18, we left Dauphin Island again by boat and landed a few miles up the Fish River, remaining here in a delightful camp among pine trees, the ground covered with leaves. The men pelted one another with dry cones and had a good time generally. The 25th of March, we started for Spanish Fort and arrived there the next day and invested at the fort. At Eastport, Mississippi, Byram of Company B, commonly known as Old Jed, got a large red rooster, the kind that have no tail, and gave him to Captain Stevens. The captain kept him, and Old Jed taking care of him. The rooster was taken with us, and we invested in Spanish Fort. Old Jed sat him on a pine stump about 4 feet high, where he roosted every night. Shooting iron, a gun. U.S. Major General Edward Richard Sprigg Canby versus Confederate States Brigadier General St. John Richardson Liddell. Canby's army was 32,200 strong. Liddell had 9,000 men. Sinkers, biscuits. On the 27th, we moved slowly up until we came near the enemy's works and established our lines about 500 yards distance. About the 1st of April, we were sent down to take the place of General Vitek's division, and about the 3rd of April, we were sent back to our original position. So in this battle, the rebels were essentially in the fort firing canister at them the whole time they were there. The rebels eventually evacuated Spanish Fort about 11 p.m. on April 8th. This was the last bloody fight of the war, for the 7th losing 12 men. Skedaddle, run away, escape. We left Spanish Fort in the forenoon of April 9th, moving up near Fort Blakely as a reserve force to help capture the fort, and left the 13th of April for Montgomery. As we neared Montgomery, The column was halted near the state prison and in sight of the state capitol building. There was a large dwelling here, and a woman stood at the gate with a pail of water for the boys. As fast as one pail was empty, she had another brought, and the men were very thankful. They in return gave the woman coffee, about a peck in all. She said it was the first coffee she had seen in about 3 years. While here, we saw the United States flag run up over the Capitol. The woman exclaimed, "There goes up the United States flag again. Thanks be to God. Now we will have good times again. They hauled it down 4 years ago, and now it is up again. I hope it will stay up forever." Arrival at Montgomery, the first capital of the Confederacy, occurred on April 25th. We did not get authentic news of the president's assassination until about the 1st of May. It caused a feeling of deep sadness and of vengeance for a while. Funeral services were held in camp, and minute guns fired for an hour at 12 o'clock. On May 10th, we embarked on steamboats for Selma, arriving there at night, and went into camp the next morning. Sunday soldier, poor or non-professional soldiers. In Selma, we received tents, the first we had had for nearly a year. A few days after arriving in Selma, Company F was sent to Cahaba, Alabama. We had little to do, and the time soon began to drag heavily. There was no more fighting to do. We were anxious to go home. The climate was hot, and the water was bad. Many men got sick, and some died. We now had plenty of rations and did not go foraging. We occasionally went out to gather blackberries, peaches, and watermelons, which were plentiful. On July 20th, 1865, we took the cars and started home. A glad day for the most of us, but sad to those too sick to travel. Many were left in the hospital, some dying there. Tar water, liquor. On July 22nd, Companies A and B joined us in Jackson as they were left at Selma at General Smith's headquarters as provost guard. The railroad being destroyed between Jackson and Black River, we had to march. We again rode cars from Black River to Vicksburg. We stayed in Vicksburg for about 3 days. Teeth dullers, another name for hardtack. The long trip home. Tree frogs, U.S. sharpshooters. At Vicksburg, we embarked on the steamer Magenta for St. Louis. Unmentionables, underwear. We stayed in St. Louis for 2 nights and 1 day. Web feet, term for cavalry, ad for infantry. At St. Louis, we started on the steamer Savannah for St. Paul. I was really disappointed that was one of the steamers I could not find a picture of. Worm castles, hardtack. We got to Winona at 9 o'clock in the morning and landed. Companies B and D were raised here, and the ladies had provided coffee, pies, cakes, and other edibles for all who wished to partake. My mother and father met me as soon as I went ashore, and a glad meeting it was. On my way up 2nd Street, I met Mrs. Turner with 3 of her sons, one on each side, the other following after. As we met, she let go of her son's hand and put her arms around my neck, saying, "James, I will kiss all the boys today." And she kissed me. I said, "Mrs. Turner, you seem to be very happy this morning." She answered, "I am. It is the happiest day of my life. I had 4 boys in the Army. A few days ago, Wilbur came home, and today Jephthah and Jacob and Cornelius came home, and I am truly happy." The tears of joy were streaming down her cheeks. I looked across the street and saw the widow of one we buried in Memphis. She stood alone and was weeping as though her heart would break. While Mrs. Turner was in tears of joy, the widow was shedding bitter tears of sorrow. A number of scenes similar to this we saw while at Winona. Worth a goober, something that amounts to a lot. Touching scenes similar to those we saw at Winona were witnessed at Red Wing and Hastings, with refreshments waiting. Yaller dog, a cowardly person, a staff officer, or courier in the Confederate Army. Arrived at St. Paul a little before noon on August 8, 1865. We were met at the levee by a large concourse of citizens, anxious to pay tribute to respect to the returning veterans. The boat landed amid salvos of artillery. It was a proud day for the surviving members of the regiment. Although of the 600 in the regiment, only 250 were well enough to appear for duty. It was also a day of sorrow and mourning. The mother and sister of Orson C. Murray of Company H came to welcome their son and brother. They asked for him and were told that Orson was dead, having died on the boat that day, almost in sight of his home. This news was a shock so unexpected that no pen can describe their grief. They were taken to the rear of the cabin where the loved one lay in the pallor of death. Debarking from the boat, we formed into line and were escorted to the Capitol. After partaking of the speeches, we went by boat to Fort Snelling, where the 7th Minnesota was discharged on August 16, 1865, 3 years from enlistment. Yankee brains, horse manure. One thing the government did that I considered very unjust, almost an insult to the veterans who served their country so faithfully, it was this. While commissioned officers were given their gun, privates and non-commissioned officers were allowed to keep their gun if they paid $6. They would make him give almost half a month's wages for the gun that he had fought battles with and had carried through heat and cold and storm, at times on half rations or less. The army by which saved the country from destruction and restored it a better and stronger nation than it had ever been before. I thought then and still think it an outrage. When we turned over our guns, Captain Stevens asked me if I wanted to keep mine. I said I did want it and would have been more than pleased to take it home, but I considered it an insult to ask me to pay for it and that the government could keep it. I bade the old gun farewell and handed it over. Virginia fence, a staggering drunk or anyone with or anything that meanders. Summary of the 7th Minnesota Infantry Volunteers. They started out with 918 men. 217 recruits were added for a total of 1,135 men. 2 officers were killed in battle, both at Tupelo. 17 non-commissioned officers or privates killed in battle, which was about 2% of the unit. 126 died of wounds or disease, about 11% of the unit. 30 officers were either reassigned or discharged. 311 non-commissioned officers and privates were discharged for promotions in other regiments. 26 deserted. 5 enlisted but refused to muster in Company D. 3 were honorably discharged, leaving 603 soldiers, or 35%, on the muster roll at the date of discharge. Tote the mail, run away quickly. That's the end of the presentation. Questions?
Question is, I give tours down at the warden's house. We talk about Company B and the Last Man Club. We also say that Company B fought for the 1st Minnesota. But you're talking about the 7th. So
right.
Is it possible they were split between the two, or are we incorrect in what we're saying?
I think the 1st Minnesota was enlisted earlier than the 7th. So that was, they had their whole 10 companies in the 1st Minnesota, the same companies that would have been in the 7th as well. So I think that completely different units.
Okay, so it's, what we're saying is correct, but just different units then.
Right.
Okay.
Yep.
Thanks.
I mean, there were many different regiments.
This is a really stupid question, but when they did all this marching, and then they'd find the enemy, and then they'd fight, how did they know they were done? Like, what happened? And then they went somewhere else? How did that all work? Like, they marched all over and then there was battle.
Well, I think the reason from what I've read, the reason the Civil War lasted so long was that they would have a battle and then they would let the enemy go. Our guys are tired, we need to rest, and they'd let the enemy go, and then they'd find them again, and they'd have another battle, and then they'd let the enemy go. And until General Grant took charge in Civil War East, he said, we're not going to do that. We're going to stay on the enemy until they're done. And that's what he did, and that's why the war ended.
A good example of that is the Battle of Gettysburg.
Yes.
When Lee was defeated and started his retreat, Lincoln expected that General Meade would pursue him, capture them, which might end the war. Guess what? Meade said, we're too tired, my soldiers were tired, let Lee escape across the Potomac, which undoubtedly extended the war for who knows how long. So that is exactly correct.
And that one, that was all the battles, pretty much. It was ridiculous. Yes.
How did people find out about this? So that farm kid working on his hay wagon in Wood County.
That's
was
that.
it newspaper, mayor?
From what I read is they had recruiters that were paid to recruit people, and so I think they went out probably to spread the word. But it's not like you turn on the radio, right, and you hear it. But it was just amazing how patriotic the people were and how they rushed to sign up. It just amazed me how fast they could get a company signed up.
Initially, in the beginning, they all thought they were signing up to go fight the Civil War, right? And then
Exactly.
within a few days,
Right.
they were doing something completely different.
Right. Yeah, it was a war they didn't sign up for, and probably not Minnesota's finest hour. Any other questions? Well, I really appreciate you coming, and
Thank you.
thanks for taking your time.